Hi, I'm Nick. I'm going to be showing you today how to change the up and down bearing on this LT40. First off, when you start, you want to put a safety chain up over the top of the mast up here and loop it underneath the bracket here for the up and down. After you've installed that chain, you want to lower the head so you take the slack out of that chain. So that chain will be the only thing holding your head from falling down for safety reasons. And then you want to remove this side cover here. You have 3 bolts across the top up here and 2 bolts on the underneath part. So remove all of those. Lift your cover out of there. Okay, next we're going to want to get this up and down motor out of the way. So we'll have to take the leads off of it here and the cross bolt out of here so we can just set this motor down out of the way. Now on the back side of this motor here, you have a tension spring that's holding the tension against your up and down belt. You want to slide that spring off of its keeper. And we're unplugging the brake wires. There is a little bracket in there that's holding the wires for the brake. You'll have to remove that also before you remove the motor. And we'll want to take the belt off of the pulley. Now we're ready to take the motor out of there. Okay, the next step, we're going to take the up and down chain loose now. It takes a 3/4 inch wrench on the underneath. It's just one nut. We're going to take off the holder for the up and down chain. We'll pull the chain up out of there and just leave it hanging down here because we're going to pull the slack off of the sprockets up here. All right, now that we have the slack in there, we have 4 bolts. That takes a 1/2 inch wrench and the bottom of your gearbox over here. We're going to remove all 4 of those. All right, now that we have all 4 of those out, we have 4 that are actually holding this bearing over here that we're replacing. And these take a 9/16 wrench. Okay, now we have to take an Allen wrench and take out 2 set screws that are holding this bearing to the shaft. It takes an 1/8 inch Allen wrench. We want to loosen those set screws up enough to where we can get the bearing to slide off the end of the shaft. And there are 2 of them, so if you only see one, you're going to want to spin the gearbox until the other one comes around so you can see it. Okay, now I have both of those loose. We're going to slide this gearbox, the bearing and all, out. We don't have to remove the whole thing out of there. We're just going to slide it out here to the side. Just enough room that we can get the bearing off the end of this shaft. There's the old bearing off. You want to set it aside. Then get your new bearing. And you're going to do the same thing. Slide your shaft out here enough to where you can just slide your new bearing on the end. Now when you're going back in with this, there's a grease zert on the outside of this bearing. You're going to want to make sure it's facing out before you slide it all back in there. But when you've got that grease zert facing out, you don't want to tighten up your set screws on here yet because we don't know where that bearing needs to set until we get the gearbox and this bearing here tight. So we'll slide it back in place. Start our bolts back in the bearing. Now I just snug those bolts up finger tight until I get my bolts in my gearbox. All right, now we've got all 4 bolts started in the bottom of the gearbox here. All 4 in our new bearing over here with our grease zerk pointed out. So we can tighten all these bolts up. Again, it takes a 1/2 inch wrench on the bottom of the gearbox. And a 9/16 on the bearing. Okay, we've got all 4 of those on the bearing tight. Now we want to tighten our set screws back up. And there again, you may have to spin the shaft here to make sure you can get to both of those set screws. You want both of them tight. Now that we have both of those tight, we want to make sure all of our slack is out of the chain, because we had so much of that pulled out here that we've got all of our slack out of the chain. And you can also spin this by hand to make sure you've got all the slack pushed out, that it's pushing down toward the tensioner on your chain down here. Okay. Now we've got all the slack out of our chain. We're going to want to reinstall our tension spring and our nut on the bottom of the tensioner for the up and down chain. You want to tighten that enough to where you can just tell you have some spring tension against that up and down chain. There we go. All right, so we've got all that, the up and down chain tight. We're ready to reinstall the motor here for the up and down. Okay, when we've got that bolt tight against there, our tension spring on the bottom down here, we want to get it hooked again. Reinstall the leads on the motor. Okay, you want to get these leads snug, but don't over tighten them. Make sure you put your caps back over. We have our brake wires that we've got to plug back in. And the bracket on the back side here that's going to hold the brake wire cable so it's not getting into the up and down motor. And now we can put our belt on. There again, this is spring loaded, so we're just going to pull up on this motor, make sure the belt's on both pulleys. And there we have it. We've changed out the up and down bearing. If this were a standard 40, this motor would not be sticking out here. It would be a smaller motor setting on top of this gearbox here. So really, you don't have to remove any of this motor or anything. You just got to take the bolts out of the bottom of the gearbox, as we did, the bolts out of the bearing there. So it's a little easier if it's a standard 40 because of your motor being on top of your gearbox here, as opposed to the 40 Super and the LT50 where the motor is sticking out here to the side. Now after we're completely done with this, all we have left is to reinstall our cover and to take off our safety chain that we installed on the up and down. All right, and we'll have to raise up our head a little bit to get the tension off of our chain back here so we can take our safety chain off. All right, now that's it on changing the up and down bearing. If you have any questions, feel free to call our customer service as always. Thanks.